Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday. Whoa, it's not Wednesday. It's Monday night. It's 7 p.m., January 27th, which means it's time for Iron Culture presented by Mass. I am here with the good Dr. Eric Helms, and a rare treat, we also have the good Dr. Mike Zourdos calling in from sunny, warm Florida, United States. Mike, long time no see. How's it going, man?
It's been good. I've been trying to get back on here every week, and the powers that be keep shutting me out. But I kept knocking on the door, and here I am.
Yeah, well, we are happy to have you. Helms, anything new in your neck of the woods? Doing okay?
Yeah, I'm doing well, and it is. Yeah, it's not even Wednesday here in Tomorrowland. It's Tuesday, so you lost some time. Trex, everything good on your end?
Um, how do I look? Do I look like a man who sleeps a lot and just doesn't have a lot going on? Do I look well rested, clear of mind?
You look like somebody who is okay with whatever state they're in. I'll give you that.
Yeah. Oh, I am a pig in the mud, but there's a lot of mud. There is a lot of mud. So yeah, a busy, busy, busy day. But of course, the highlight of my day is being here with the good people in the live chat. Which, by the way, folks, if you like what we're doing here, if you support the movement, and you want to make that support more official, more substantive, there are many ways to do it. You can like, rate, subscribe, review. You can catch the show live on YouTube most Mondays. That's on the Mass Research Review YouTube channel and the Iron Culture Podcast YouTube channel. Of course, we're hitting all the podcast feeds wherever you like to get them. So like, rate, subscribe, review, share, tell a friend, all that stuff. And of course, a great way to support the show is to join us in the live chat. You could actually be a part of the content creation process by dropping an insightful question in the live chat when we record. You can, of course, go to massresearchreview.com slash Iron Culture.
Iron Culture.
Yes. Is there a dash between iron and culture?
Let's see.
It's been a minute for me.
Let's see.
Come on, Mike. You made the webpage.
It's going to be Mass Research. I did make the webpage, massresearchreview.com slash Iron Culture.
Okay, with no dash between iron and culture.
No dash, sir. One word.
Okay. I haven't really advertised that link for a minute. So if you can't catch us live and you still want to submit questions, head to that link. You can submit questions literally 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And then on leap year, you could do 366 if you like. We literally never close it. And then, of course, the best way to support us, the whole thing that makes this stuff work is the Mass Research Review. Every single month, we review the most useful, most practical, most important papers that come out, scientific research papers in exercise, nutrition, and adjacent topics. We review them, we pontificate on how you might use the findings of those papers, and we publish it the first of the month every single month. Within the Mass Research Review, if you join the Mass community, you're not just getting articles, you're also getting audio content, you're getting video content. It is a multimedia experience, and it helps you stay on top of your game, whether you are an enthusiastic lifter or someone who trains people for a living. All right. Let's see. Helms, you mentioned off air that there was some kind of bodybuilding news. I can't imagine that it's more earth-shattering than the college football news, but let's hear what you got, and then we'll compare and see who's more interesting.
Easily more earth-shattering, and I don't even know what the news is, nor would I understand it if you told me. So this is coming from a position of high confidence, low knowledge, tip of the peak of Dunning-Kruger. I'm here for it. The World Natural Bodybuilding Federation announced last week that for the 2025 season, they're introducing classic bodybuilding. Now, this is big news because the existence of, and I know you're on one side of the fence on this, Trexler, with your history and some of these lesser-known organizations, the existence of classic bodybuilding as a division in natural bodybuilding is quite controversial. The prior position of the World Natural Bodybuilding Federation, which I largely agree with, was that natural bodybuilding is classic bodybuilding. And for those who don't know, classic bodybuilding, or the classic physique division, was instituted starting in 2012 or somewhere around there, I believe, in the enhanced realm, basically as a way to curtail drug use. And it instituted it using height and weight cutoffs for each weight so that the competitors could not get as big. And it was due to two reasons. One, because there was a genuine interest in more classic looking physiques, which is probably why natural bodybuilding is on the rise at the moment, and we're seeing an increase in that. Why Chris Bumstead became probably the most popular and well-known male physique athlete in the world, and recently retired after winning the title 6 times. But then shortly after, enhanced bodybuilding introduced the classic division, which also emphasized posing and emphasized, these more classic lines, slightly different mandatories. Natural bodybuilding, as they often do, went, oh, I'm just going to copy my big brother without thinking about it at all, not realizing that we don't really have a drug use problem in natural bodybuilding, believe it or not, despite what YouTube says. And that we don't have 300-pound mass monsters running around in WNBF shows or OCB shows or NGA shows, etc. So it became this highly divergent division where it's completely different depending on the federation. Sometimes it's just the I'm going to show up not in shape division, the 8 weeks out division, because the equivalent of not getting quite as big and looking muscular is looking a little softer to try to look a little more classic. Sometimes it is the identical to the bodybuilding division with slightly different poses and trunks that hide my glutes division, which is another version of it. And sometimes it's we're going to emphasize posing, but it's basically the same. So it's been an interesting division that has been not super well consistently judged in natural bodybuilding and have been very divisive. And I think the fact that the WNBF is talking about implementing it is really interesting. And a funny thing in the enhanced ranks, while it is sometimes like that we're not going to get as lean for natural bodybuilding, in the enhanced ranks, the classic physique guys are typically getting as lean, if not leaner, than the open bodybuilding guys, because they have to work so hard to make the height class cutoff. And for example, Chris Bumstead is known for having really, really lean striations everywhere in many of the competitors in that division. So it's funny how on the natural bodybuilding side of the fence, in some places, it has become a softer look, while it is absolutely not that in IFBB, because they're killing themselves to make the height and weight cutoff. So it'll be really cool to see how the WNBF does it. I don't have final word on this, but my suspicion is that they're going to focus more on the posing side of it, which I think is really cool from a historical perspective, because classic bodybuilding, if you look at it from a historical lens, the classic quote unquote approach to bodybuilding was that the posing routine is actually a judged round, that there was more emphasis on presentation, and it had a little more of that art sport blend. So it'll be interesting to see where the WNBF puts their emphasis and where they plant their flag in the ground. And I think it is probably going to be ultimately a good move, because there's a lot of people who do like the classic division and don't see it as completely homogenous with the bodybuilding division, even in natural bodybuilding where you don't get mass monsters.
Good. So are you done yet?
Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, I just want to say, after that little demonstration there, I know what you're doing, and I don't like it, and I know the audience doesn't like it. So you're taking a shot across the bow, a jab at me, because much like Bo Jackson, much like Deion Sanders, I am a two-sport professional athlete. Once in natural bodybuilding, once in natural classic bodybuilding. And for you to diminish the efforts of what I had to go through to compete at the highest levels of both sports on literally the same day is a joke. And you've made a fool of yourself in front of about 3 million good people who are in the chat. So with that out of the way,
there's a lot more people in the mass research review online, because I'm in the Iron Culture and we've got 13 currently.
Yeah,
we're 28 in the mass research review one. Yeah.
Those are
28.
The scaling's all off. It's not. That's not. You're not to take that number literally.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I tell you what. Donald John Trump, when he was running for president the first time, he made a comment about winning so much that you're going to get tired of winning. And at first, I thought that was hyperbole. I didn't put a lot of real stock into that. But the college football news, which people come to this show for, is that apparently there was something to that. Ohio State defensive coordinator Jim Knowles won and won and won, and he got tired of winning, and so he left. He was snatched from Ohio State by in-conference rival Penn State, notorious loser who has not been able to beat Ohio State in recent memory. So, Mike, how are you feeling about this, being a fellow college football guy?
And Big Ten guy.
Yeah.
Also, a few minutes ago when you said, I know what you're doing, but I don't like it, you unknowingly quoted Happy Gilmore to Shooter McGavin in the bar scene, and I was very excited about that. I thought that's where you were going for a second, and we were going to go down a great path there, but we pivoted back to college football, which is always a great path. So as a fellow supporter of the Big Ten, and the only team that's really consistently beating Ohio State right now. So I'm pretty sure Michigan is the real national champion. It was shocking. How I found out this morning was I received a text to a group from none other than Dr. Zach Robinson, Ohio State grad. The other person in this group is PhD candidate Josh Pelland, first author of the big volume meta-regression that's out there, and Zach said something to the effect of, what the hell is this? And so I immediately went and looked and found what happened, and I said, Zach, you'll have to explain to me why, and I specifically chose these words, why, quote, would he make a lateral move in terms of title? And I chose that word title because I'm aware it's a step down. And the Ohio State fan that Zach is, knowing that I'm a Michigan fan, shot back, what do you mean lateral move?
Yeah.
Right? I said, no.
Very touchy.
So
yeah.
We went on about this morning for a little bit. So I have to imagine there was some strife there with the coaching staff at Ohio State. Ultimately, despite the terrible play calling against Michigan, which is what lost them that game, the offensive side stays. But in a bigger picture of this, Trex, if I'm Ryan Day, I got my championship and I am out.
Wow.
I leave this stress behind me. I don't want to deal with the NIL. I don't want to deal with the parents calling. I don't want to deal with all this. I leave. You got your national championship, and I get out of there. He's going to hang around, it looks like, and I wish him well, but I would have gotten out of there if I were him. But shocking to see Knowles kind of leave like this after a national championship and to a in-conference rival, as you said.
Yeah, it's funny that even though you were so delicate with the wording, you got the immediate clapback. And I think the incredible thing about college football is that you win your first national championship in 10 years, and it makes you feel confident for about 24 hours. And then you're right back to being, hyper, absolutely touchy, ready to fight everybody about your team. Like it is a 24-hour window of success before you're already back to your, crazy fan status.
I said, Trex, I understand I understand he's making more money, but why the quote lateral move in terms of title? I got back lateral move, 5 question marks. This is falling down the stairs.
Absolutely. Well, Helms, your eyes are still open, but they are looking a bit glazed over. So I think it's time to jump into some fitness questions. We haven't gone into the after hours question portal recently, so I do want to dive into there. And there are a couple good ones.
Hold the phone.
Okay.
There are some other things we must announce that have recently happened.
All right.
And this is not, and I'm also aware that if I give more Iron Game news, that it does require more football. But I will allow you guys to maybe take a rain check on that if you're okay with that, Trex.
Yes.
Okay, cool. And you know what? I may even compete in Classic Physique with the WNBF this year. So that is just another olive branch to make this okay. And if I do, I won't say I pulled with Bo Jackson. I'll say I pulled an Eric Trexler, a Dr. Eric Trexler. Okay?
Thank you.
That's my agreement with you. The 2025 Sheffield did just happen. It was live streamed. It was huge. This is the invitational meet, the biggest meet outside of World Games and IPF Worlds, where to even get there, you have to be within a certain proximity to a world record and be from an underrepresented region, or be a wild card pick who's in that range, or to actually be a world champion. And you get 5,000 British pounds if you break the squat, bench, or deadlift world record in your division, your weight class. And additionally, it is ranked based upon the percentage above the world record. So it is a cross weight class competition. And I just want to give a huge shout out to both Agata Sitko as well as Kel Beckland, who both won their respective weight classes. And I think a historic aspect of the 2025 Sheffield, it is really showing how the sport has evolved. And now every aspect of the athlete needs to be optimized in order to be competitive at the highest level. Kel Beckland, you might know, was the last person who took a world championship off of Taylor Atwood back in the day in 2017 before his historic run. He did, of course, have a stumbling in 2023, but this is before Taylor Atwood became the most dominant 74 kilo lifter. Shell, who has world game titles as an equipped lifter, world championships as an equipped lifter, and also beat Taylor Atwood back in the day before he became the Taylor Atwood we all know, dropped down to 66 kilos and put up a world record total that was 106% of the world record, blowing the old 725 kilo record out of the water with a 770 at 66 kilos. Insane, mind-boggling, and it is a true outlier performance, and it shows you just how important maximizing one's body composition and the weight-making process is. Big shout-out to Kedrick Kwan, a guest of the show, current PhD student of mine, and probably the most sought-after nutritionist in the game right now. He was part of that process. And also huge shout out to Joe, who did all the work. And a very similar thing happened on the women's side. Agata Sitko, who has now world championship titles and world records across multiple weight classes. She has bench press world records, I think, in 3. She dropped down from 76 to 69 kilos. And she totaled, I think, just under 630 kilos at 69 kilos as a woman. She benched 158, if I recall correctly, at a body weight of 69 kilos, and she got 104% of the world record. And she beat herself from last year as a 76 kilo lifter. The first person to win 2 Sheffields in a row, because when you set the bar high, then you have to clear it again. So 2 examples of people dropping down a full weight class and being able to clinch that title by attacking quote unquote vulnerable world records and showing the importance of nutrition for powerlifting. So I'll leave it there. But those are big pieces of news. And the final thing I'll say that we can all get behind to unify us is science is going on right now. Big meta-regression that Dr. Refalo led, specifically looking at the impact of protein intake while dieting, relevant to what we just talked about, or its ability to help someone retain or even gain lean mass during an energy deficit, and the interacting effect there. Both myself and Dr. Trexler were co-authors on that. That dropped open access as an invitational review we wrote for the Strength and Conditioning Journal. We've got a post up on Instagram right now if you want to check it. It's a collaborative post. And we are going to have Dr. Refalo on the show in just about a week. So we won't get into it too much because we're going to hear it from the proverbial horse's mouth, if you will. And with that, I will shut up, Trex, and I'll let you take it from here.
All right. Well, I tell you what, we do have people in the live chat asking us to elaborate and opine on that meta-regression with Dr. Refalo. As you said, Helms, we'll hear that straight from the horse's mouth pretty soon. So we're going to table that for now. There are some Instagram posts floating around kind of talking about what the findings mean or don't mean. But we will get into that, but everybody just sit tight so we can really give that paper and that question the attention and time it deserves. I'm going to call an audible. We already have enough awesome questions in the live chat. I want to dive right in there. And, last week we really fell short. We didn't really hit anything in the live chat. So I want to make sure we really do some work in the chat here. So let's see. Got a question from Dwight. I was out of town for 3 weeks. Only went to the gym once, stopped taking creatine, got COVID. A whole sequence going on here. I lost 7 pounds. Tell me it'll be okay and I'll gain the muscle right back. Zourdos, can you be a voice of reason? Can this gentleman, Dwight, expect a rapid and enjoyable bounce back from this 3-week series of events? What do you think?
Dwight, are you good at chess by any chance?
Am I good at chess?
I'm just trying to think of other non-physical activities because I don't think there's any coming back.
Oh dear.
I think Dwight is. I'm sorry, buddy. I wish I could tell you, Dwight, it's going to be fine. Dwight, I have good news. You're going to be just fine. And all kidding aside, when you are away for a few weeks and you get sick, especially something like COVID, you feel that, hey, I am going to almost never get this back. Not to I'll get into this a little bit, but to give you some context, Dwight, you're gonna be fine. I haven't told anybody this. I don't think I've told my mass colleagues this, but I got pretty bad COVID back in August, and I collapsed and went to the hospital and hit my head and cracked it open. It was bad. It was middle of the night. Actually, the kid found me on the floor and had to get mom and we went there and it was rough. I was in rough shape, but Dwight, I had to take some time off, but I came back and got everything back. I'm in a different sport here, training for endurance sport. It came back. Everything came back pretty quickly. It was just fine. Obviously, there's long COVID and people can have different symptoms from that in different times, but you'll be okay. Anytime that you have to take a considerable amount of time off, you start back and it's a little bit of a struggle, and mentally you have to kind of get back in the gym and you might open yourself up to some soreness. But now after the little personal story, we can get to some of the scientific principles of this, because we do know there's detraining and retraining studies. So let's push aside the illness for a second, because I can't speak to exactly what your COVID symptoms were or if you have any long-lasting effects from that. That's going to vary from person to person, and we only know so much. So if you have a few weeks off, we know from detraining and retraining studies that if you take 3 weeks off and then you train again, you're going to be able to gain back what you lost in 3 weeks, if you lost much at all, fairly quickly. Now, if you were sick, I'm going to actually suggest you probably lost something because you were probably bedridden a little bit or really not moving around so much. So I won't go as far to say you maintained all your gains. I'd say you probably did lose some. Maybe you weren't eating as much because you were sick. You weren't hydrated as much. But once you get back into the gym, how are you going to go about it? Well, first, we're pretty susceptible to muscle damage and soreness when we get back in the gym at first, right? So that's when we get back to this principle that we've referred to a lot called the repeated bout effect, right? When you repeat a bout of exercise, you get an effect of less soreness or less damage. So what that means is after those 3 weeks off, Dwight gets back into the gym, he lifts weights a little bit, he's pretty sore, he's pretty beat up right away. So we want to use that repeated bout effect, or that RBE, to our advantage. The thing that we always miss about this concept is that you get the magnitude of the repeated bout effect based upon the magnitude of your original session. So that first week back, you don't need to do very much, Dwight. You could train maybe 30-40% of your 1RM for light, some low reps, pretty far from failure, and then you would still be less sore in week 2 than you would be if you didn't do anything in week 1. The point is, I would encourage you to start light, gradually work up to that, and then within a month, a couple months, you'll be perfectly fine. You'll be right back to where you were. So I wouldn't stress too much about it, but I'm not going to sometimes I think we like to overstate to say, don't worry, you'll be fine. And while that's true, I do want to sympathize with Dwight, because we've all been there, and it's not easy and it's frustrating. Right? And it's not just the fact that we feel like we've lost some size, we've lost some strength. It's the fact that just mentally, it's tough to not go to the gym, to miss out on that time, to know you're not there. So when you start back, start easy. You'll get the repeated bout effect. After a week or so, you'll feel like you want to really start pushing things up. So if you're starting maybe 5-6 reps from failure, maybe each week add a rep add one RIR, just gradually moving up, start really light, and you'll get back there on all the exercises you're doing. So it's not over. The most egregious thing I heard, though, is that you weren't taking creatine. You're going to need to get back on the supplements as soon as you can. But I hope you're okay. Hopefully you don't have any long COVID symptoms. But as someone that's been in that situation and had to take some time off for that, it's frustrating, but you'll get it back. Just work up gradually.
Yeah, and as Mike Zourdos always says, if you have to choose between exercising and taking your supplements, take your supplements. I mean, they are giving you 80% of the gains that you might expect. So I really like that you highlighted that, Mike. Great point.
You got it.
Trex, there's
yes.
actually a question related to the repeated bout effect that might be a good one to piggyback off this in iron culture.
Wow, what do they got?
So they asked, is soreness a good indicator to use to determine appropriate session volume? If very low volumes like one set leaves you sore for 4+ days, is that enough? Or would you still recommend doing more sets? For example, one set of deficit RDLs makes my hams sore for 5+ days. Despite having RDLs in my program for over a year, is my RDL maximum recoverable volume 1 set per week? Are RDLs too fatiguing? Or should I do more volume to adapt? And that is from Killer Katibi 09, excuse me. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are multiple factors that impact the repeated bout effect. And it's not a static thing. You don't have a set delayed onset muscle soreness response. And probably the most useful study that's super applied that I would recommend you check out is one by Gomez and colleagues that came out in 2019. And it is titled, High Frequency Resistance Training is Not More Effective Than Low Frequency Resistance Training and Increasing Muscle Mass and Strength in Well-Trained Men. So these are legitimate intermediate lifters if you look at some of their stats, how long they've been lifting and their strength scores. And what's cool about this is it demonstrates the disconnect between the delayed onset muscle soreness response and the actual adaptations when you manipulate something that we know is not even that related to hypertrophy for the most recent meta-regression by the group that Pelland led out of FAU. They did not see a strong relationship between the frequency of training a muscle group per week and hypertrophy when you control for volume. There's a very small effect from going from like a fractional frequency of like 0 to 1, but that's really just compared to a control group. So what they observed was one group was doing the same amount of volume as the other, training all of their volume in a single session. And then they had the high frequency group that spread that volume across 3 sessions. So it was basically a full body split versus a quote unquote body part split. And and they had data at week 1, week 4, and also week 8. And these are well-trained lifters, so they have been doing these movements. When you look at week 1, you see very similar soreness scores out of 10 in the chest, elbow flexors, elbow extensors, thigh, and calf as you do in week 8. They only go down a very small amount. So the scores range from 4 to 7.5 in the chest in the low frequency group and 4.5 to 7 from week 1 to week 8. But in the high frequency group, doing the same amount of volume, they were at 0 on average with a score range of 0 to 0.5 by week 8, but the same level of adaptation. So I think it's really important to use this data to contextualize what can DOMs tell us. And DOMs will tell you that that muscle group was involved, but it probably doesn't act as a proxy for the stimulus. It might be a proxy for the change in the stimulus. So if you were to go from 5 sets to 20, even if you had a relatively high frequency, you'd probably be sore. If you went from a 3 RIR to forced repetitions with a partner spotting you, you'd probably be more sore. So there are conditional ways which DOMs can tell us this, but the actual adaptation itself is not going to be directly related to it. And you could take the same volume on a muscle group that you've been doing forever and simply spread it out across the week, and you might get a reduction in soreness, but still have the same stimulus. So I think it's just really important to understand the interaction of those effects.
Absolutely. I was going to say, Helms, this is certainly an oversimplification, as all things are when they're a one-word answer. But when people ask me, is soreness, a proxy for muscle growth? I say no, and they say, well, then what does it represent? And usually my single-word answer is novelty. You did a thing that you're not accustomed to, which is why, people who are, months and months into very, very productive powerlifting training or bodybuilding training, I was just talking to Steve Hall of the Revive Stronger podcast, and dude is jacked. He's been like permanently in a highly trained state for like 3 years straight. And he said the most sore he's been in recent memory, I'm paraphrasing, was when he went out and played soccer for a whole day. And it's like, is that the secret he needs to unlock more growth, is going out and playing soccer? Of course not. It's the least hypertrophy inducing thing he's done in probably 3 years. But it was a novel stimulus. He was using muscles in ways they're not used to, and he got really, really sore. And I bet if he went and did, 6 heavy sets of bench, he wouldn't have a touch of soreness in his pecs, So it really is more of a novelty thing. But Mike, I cut you off. What were you going to say?
Nothing. Just to, draw some parallels and piggyback off of what Helms said, is to really get down even more practical about this, is just always be careful about how you allocate your volume, right? And so when Eric's talking about splitting it up a few days of the week, if you're only training it once a week, maybe split those sets up over to 3 days per week. But I'll go a step farther. And so the commenter specifically mentioned Romanian deadlifts. And so this trains the muscle at very long lengths. And so that exercise specifically is going to open someone up to more soreness. So if you do bench press regularly, it's unlikely to kind of, go along with what Trex was saying about Mr. Hall, that you're going to have fatigue or muscle damage and soreness that you're going to have from the bench press on a regular basis if you're training it with a decent amount of volume. But every time you do RDLs, you might feel a little something just because of the length and position that it puts you in, and the training a muscle through long length. So it's not just allocating volume in terms of, hey, I was doing 6 sets, so now I'm going to do 2 sets of this on Monday, 2 sets on Wednesday, and 2 sets on Friday. But it's also being just very cautious about where you're placing certain exercises within a week. So let's say you do a lot of machine-based work and then early in the week, and then on Fridays is typically when you're going to do your barbell squats, if you do those once a week, whatever you're utilizing. And on Wednesdays, you're always doing some sort of RDLs before that. Well, that's not a great place to put the RDLs in there, because you're putting them maybe only 48 hours before you're going to squat. And that squatting is a movement where you're probably a bit more concerned about performance and the load that's on the barbell, whereas on your machine-based movements, you're not as concerned. So in that case, I'd put the RDLs either, let's say, on Monday or maybe on Friday after squats, right? And then you have the weekend to recover, and then Monday or Tuesday, you're doing some lower body machine-based work. So I would say, in addition to what Eric said, which I wholeheartedly agree with, not only should you be splitting up the volume appropriately, although more on that to come in another meta-regression on per session volume we have coming out soon from the great Jake Remmert, but also how you're allocating those exercises throughout the week. So if you think of something like RDLs or skull crushers, things like this that tend to make you a little sore, just position them appropriately and allocate that volume appropriately.
Yeah. The last thing I think I'll say on this trick, because I know we got plenty of questions, is I also don't want people to think that we're taking kind of like the meme evidence-based perspective on soreness means nothing and it tells you 0, that I think lacks a bit of nuance as well. Because you might have just heard Dr. Zourdos mention how, hey, the RDLs cause a lot of soreness because they train you at a long muscle length. And it's not just that you reach the long muscle length, but when you think about the lever arm, if your torso is a lever arm and the barbell is directly below your scapula in your hands, it is the furthest distance from your glute and your hamstring when they're the longest in that lift. That's also what makes the RDL a pretty good movement for hypertrophy. If you were to compare just the position of your body and not think about the load, you go, oh, well, why don't I get that same soreness from a 45-degree hyperextension? It's because you're in an altered position in space. So now, when your torso is straight and parallel to the ground, your glutes and hamstrings are in a shorter position. And I would actually expect that if you compared the hamstring and glute hypertrophy from doing a 45-degree leg hyperextension versus an RDL, with all else equal, large enough sample size, and a sufficient amount of time, we would probably see greater hypertrophy. So it is true that things that tend to increase muscle damage in the context of resistance training, which you may experience delayed onset muscle soreness from, often co-vary with the things that tend to produce more mechanical tension, which stimulates greater hypertrophy. But because of the magnitude of the repeated bout effect that you can get, and the individual variation in the repeated bout effect, it's going to be different between individuals. I attended a really cool talk earlier last week. As a Professor Antoine Nordes from France.
Did they finally merge Spain and France?
It would be great. Think about the food combinations we get, right?
Wow.
Sorry. So yeah, from Nantes University. That's what was in my head, and somehow I just dyslexified all the words. He had a really cool presentation on changes in fascicle length that you can measure in real time, actually strapping ultrasound probes to people, and even using some 3D ultrasound techniques, which are going to be all the rage in future hypertrophy work, because they can essentially give you the same data as MRI, but with far less cost. Anyway, they found in some studies, or he was reporting literature that found this, that there was moderate correlations between the amount of muscle damage someone experienced following an activity and the degree of fascicle length change during the movement. So this tells us that there is probably that mechanical component to muscle damage. There has been some messaging online that, hey, muscle damage is purely a biochemical phenomenon, the more contractions you do. And that might be a component to it. But the fact that the more fascicle length change you get seems to predict individual level increases in muscle damage tells you that maybe there is something to the actual mechanical stretching, the whole quote unquote sarcomere popping hypothesis. And it's probably a combination of the two. And that's probably why the eccentric contraction also tends to enhance the amount of muscle damage, because the individual fibers don't lengthen in a uniform manner when you do eccentric contraction. So some of them reach longer lengths than others. So anyway, cool stuff. And muscle damage does co-vary with mechanical tension, but it is not a perfect one-to-one, and that's why we probably shouldn't use delayed onset muscle soreness, especially between individuals, but not even necessarily within an individual if you're seeing those changes in activity and novelty, like the two doctors I'm with talked about, as a way to predict like hyper.
And I've had similar questions come my way about, like, is the pump predictive of hypertrophy? And as we were talking about recently, I'm not sure we really know that yet, but maybe your student's project will shed some light on that. But, you know, what I usually tell people is, like, if you're going into the gym and you're trying a new exercise, by default, we're introducing novelty. And if you want to know, am I really stimulating the muscle I was going for here? Well, if it got sore 48 to 72 hours later and you got a pretty killer pump during the exercise, like, we're getting useful information here, you know? However, you know, you probably shouldn't decide once the soreness isn't as severe when you keep doing that same exercise over a 16-week period, I guess it's not working anymore, right? So like you said, Helms, soreness isn't telling us nothing, but we have to very carefully contextualize what information are we getting from this. And sometimes it's just, hey, you just did a thing that you're not used to doing. You know, you just played soccer and that's new for you. All right, Helms, I want to quickly address, we had a pair of questions about protein that I think we can answer relatively quickly. Actually, a few if I think of one that came into the after hours portal, but one person was asking, vegan diet, I'm trying to get, you know, lean protein sources, high protein diet, minimizing carb and fat intake. So that's one question. Another question was, I'm getting a lot of my protein from supplements. They're, you know, I got some kind of hookup. It's very affordable. Should I be worried about that? And then a related question was, you know, every 6-12 months or so, another person kind of reposts another story about, you know, high levels of heavy metals contaminating protein powders. So a quick little, you know, rapid fire on protein. What's your recommendation for vegans on a high protein, calorie restricted diet? What kind of sources can they use? Do you have any concerns about over reliance on protein shakes or protein supplements? And if so, are those concerns related to heavy metal contamination or something else entirely?
Great series of questions. So as a pescatarian with a vegetarian wife, I do have some practical insights here, but I think, Trexler, you are full vegan, so you might even have some additional ones.
Well,
and we're in different.
More on that to come, but yes.
Okay, that has changed. You have been vegan in the past.
Yes.
Okay, so you have some insights as well, and we're in different regions, so hopefully we can give a useful spread of answers. But tempeh, tofu, um, textured vegetable proteins, and some of the fake meats, if you're into that sort of thing, they've gotten really, really good. There are multiple brands out there, and checking the back of the label to see which ones has a reasonably good carb and fat ratio to protein. There are some pretty damn good ones out there these days that don't taste terrible, which was not the case back in the day. You had to sacrifice on taste, calorie content, cost, or maybe all three just to get to where you needed to be. But that's definitely changed these days. Also, if you're comfortable with powders and bars, there are a lot of good options there. Pea protein, pea and rice blends, even nut-based isolated forms or mixtures there. Those are all on the table, I'd recommend for a vegan. The only time it gets really challenging is when you're dieting, because if you want whole food options, which are more filling, in my experience, they typically come with carbohydrates like, chickpeas, beans, things like that. And you're going to get tired pretty quickly of tempeh and tofu and some of these fake meat options. And you may find yourself consuming, say, more fiber than you want, more carbohydrate, more fat, or if you go the engineered food side of it, you might end up consuming more sugar alcohols in some cases, and other things that are in the vegan protein bars that are the same as they're in the non-vegan protein bars. So it is a little bit challenging when you're dieting, but I think outside of that, those are what I would generally recommend. Trex, is there any other ones that you think are quite good with your experience?
Not really. I think it is important to kind of recognize, like, it is hard. I think, like, sometimes people that are really enthusiastic about promoting plant-based diets, they may be, not because they're being disingenuous or dishonest, but they kind of gloss over how difficult it is, specifically when you're on a very calorie restricted diet. Like, is it that hard to go vegan these days when you got plenty of calories to play with? Not at all. I mean, like, especially when you consider how good some of the plant-based meat alternatives have gotten. Like, it's kind of a walk in the park, and you can go back in archives of me when I was kind of, still vegan. I'll elaborate on that in a minute. But I was like, this is super easy because, like, yeah, it was great. Like, I had plenty of calories to play with: chickpeas, lentils, tofu, fake meat, you name it. It was totally fine. Having said that, I've talked previously about how, like, I have been taking a medication that causes, like, a lot of weight gain and a lot of, like, serious appetite elevation. And it got to the point where I was like, I need to start, like, trying to stop the bleeding here and restrict my calories. And through the course of that, I did reintroduce dairy just to make my life a little bit easier. So now I am still very strictly vegetarian, but I do incorporate dairy so I can do more low-fat cottage cheese, fat-free Greek yogurt, things of that nature, just to make my life easier. I do use a lot of whey protein. And Helms, I think we were talking a million years ago about how even back then when you were in prep, you had mentioned that your protein sources did tend to shift a little bit, where in the off season, you didn't rely as heavily on, I think it was dairy and fish. And then as you got more deep into contest prep, it kind of became not a necessity, but definitely a big quality of life booster. Made your life a lot easier, I would say.
It did. And even since then, there has been more low fat, low carb alternative meat options that have become available. But some of them do give me, just to say it nicely, it makes me fart a lot.
Mm-hmm.
If I consume a crap ton of some of the textured vegetable proteins that are low in fat and low in carbohydrates. I'm not sure which one it specifically is, or I couldn't isolate it very effectively. So yeah, the quality of life aspect there, I would opt for a low fat, like a skyr or a Greek yogurt or a strained yogurt, or potentially egg whites or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things, like, this is all about lowering barriers to entry and reducing friction to make this easier. And sometimes these are self-imposed barriers, generally, but not all the time. People typically fall into deciding to be more plant-based for a couple of reasons. I think probably the minority of people who follow iron culture en masse would do so because they believe it's a scientifically advantageous diet for performance or body composition. And that was probably at its height around the Game Changers documentary, which you did some great science communication around Trex. So I don't think I need to address that. I would say that I think you can get to all the same outcomes for sport performance and body composition change, but it requires a little more work in these certain circumstances, so long as you meet your protein requirement and some of the associated micronutrients and things like that, creatine, et cetera. Other people will believe from a scientific perspective that it is healthier. And I think when we evaluate all the scientific literature on this, it becomes apparent that plant-based diets are health promoting because they include a lot of micronutrients, fiber, and a lot of things that are good for you. But it is not the presence of meat when all else is controlled that is necessarily a negative, unless we're talking about like charred, processed red meat in high doses. I would not venture a guess that a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet is less healthy than a vegan diet, nor a pescatarian diet. And it could arguably in some cases be better for certain outcomes because you're probably getting a better complement of fats as an example. So it is really the presence of these plants that is helpful rather than the absence of meat, especially when we look at long-term diets. So from a health and performance perspective, it's not better. So some people, if that's their main reason for becoming vegan, they are trying to avoid meat because they have a belief that it's harming their performance or harming their health. That's not the case. So that's one barrier removed. A much more common one, especially in our audience, is people who are doing this for ethical reasons, either because of how they want animals to be treated humanely, or because of the potential effect on climate change and related to the manufacturing process. I'm not very well informed on either of these extensively, but to some degree I am, because the reason I chose to be more plant-based is for ethical reasons that largely fall into the primary category, where I'm much more confident in my understanding of, say, factory farming and treatment of animals. So,
hey man, just so you know, if you want to know the real truth and the real science about climate change, I'm going to email you some pamphlets tonight. It's going to blow your mind.
Thank you so much, Trex. I appreciate that. I will absolutely open that email. The ethical side of things, typically you'll see a relatively uniform approach of vegans of anything that has to exploit, use, or use anything from animal products. It's a no-go. With some people even going, I'm not going to use honey. I think it's important to maybe have a little more nuance there. If you're concerned about the treatment of animals, if you're concerned about certain impacts on the environment, do the extra step and educate yourself on some of these things, because there are in some cases where the ethical argument is more flimsy. A great one you pointed out, Trexler, is whey protein. It's essentially a byproduct of the dairy industry that's going to occur regardless. And that is sold at cost, basically. And that's basically where we get all of our whey. It's going to be produced no matter what, until we get to a point in society where everyone goes, you know what? I don't want to participate in the dairy industry, which we're not at yet, folks.
Yeah. Until cheese is abolished, whey is going to be around.
100%. So I would venture a guess that you are probably not contributing to the consumption of animal products or the continuance of the dairy industry by consuming whey. And it is really hard to make a case ethically why you shouldn't consume it. And that, if you're like, hey, I'm vegan plus whey, man, it makes all this stuff a lot easier. So just putting that out there. So those are some of those. Sometimes when I have clients or people asking questions, I try to carefully interrogate their why behind it, because sometimes I encounter certain beliefs that may not be backed by. I'm not trying to change their beliefs. I just want to make sure that the beliefs are founded in accurate information, if that makes any sense. And the last one I'll say, there is a persistent belief that soy is somehow harmful to men, that it promotes estrogen-like effects, or that it can, hamper body composition. And that has been pretty consistently disproven with all the highest quality data. And I am not concerned about soy intakes, even in relatively high amounts. So I know there are some guys especially who go on a plant-based diet, but they try to avoid tofu or tempeh or things like that. And it just makes it harder on them. And they think they're being evidence-based. And you can find some old data, but it's not very high quality and it's not up to date. And if anything, the effects are neutral to positive.
All right, good stuff. Now, just really quickly, I do want to make sure we get to a bunch of questions in the chat here. So, Helms, do you have major concerns if someone tells you that maybe they're having 4 servings a day of protein supplements, as a major source of their daily protein? And would that differ if they were getting plant-based protein supplements versus animal-based protein supplements?
Major concerns, no, but I would actually want to know a little bit more. So the supplement industry is not homogenous. There are lower versus higher quality supplements. In most cases, if you're on the lower quality end and you're consuming a whole bunch of protein supplements, you're going to know it, because if they include bars and certain formulations of powders, you're getting a lot of sugar alcohols and potentially other non-nutritive sweeteners and other ingredients, which for many people, at least in that type of dose and frequency, are going to produce a fair amount of gastrointestinal discomfort. So if you're not experiencing a lot of gas, you're not experiencing any kind of GI discomfort, all good. The other thing that's a little more, I don't know, insidious sounds way too dramatic for this, but I'll say insidious just because I'm a dramatic person. There are some pretty low quality protein supplements, and protein quality as a blanket statement is generally not something I care about if your dose is sufficiently high. But if we're talking about 80% of your intake coming from something like collagen, then I'm starting to go, Or if it's the same vegan source that is not like a full complete source. Like, even though pea protein is really, really good in terms of its branched chain amino acid content, I think is low in lysine, Trex?
I'd have to check. I'm not sure.
This is what we have Google for. Go ahead and Google it. But one of the essential amino acids, pea protein, is relatively low in, even though in the context of a big diet, it compares really favorably to like whey protein in terms of its digestibility, its speed, and its content of the branched chain amino acids, and leucine content especially. But I do think it's either low in methionine or lysine. I can't remember which. But anyway, if you're getting a single vegan source that's not soy, or it's not a blend, like sometimes you'll get quote unquote vegan's whey, which is like 30% rice, 70% pea protein. Like, if you're getting that all the time and they're complementary sources, not a problem. So you need to look at the specific product. And then the final component to that about heavy metals, I actually just don't know enough about that. I have not looked into the data on heavy metal contamination in supplements, what regions that's common in, and even if you do, say, third-party batch testing or like label testing, whether they even look at that, or if they're just looking at, say, banned substances or other things that are not supposed to be there. So I unfortunately don't. I'm not a well-informed enough science communicator on that topic to speak to it.
Yeah, I know that there are some third-party testing services that do consider that, and they do include that in their kind of testing protocol. So if you're very concerned about it, you can go that route. My understanding last time I looked into this was that it is, and I will acknowledge this as being more of a plant-based biased guy, it is slightly more of a concern when you're using plant-based protein sources as the protein source in the powder, because it ultimately comes down to, as I understand it, that the heavy metal composition of the soil in which that protein source was grown. But the last paper I looked into on this found that for the vast majority of proteins that they tested, we're talking about being well below what they consider dangerous levels in terms of the heavy metals, unless you're going, way above great shirt, Helms, for the YouTube viewers. But it only becomes a concern when you are getting a really, really massive amount of your protein from it. But having said that, okay, here's a little curveball I'll throw into the mix. Helms and Mike, you're aware of the nutrition literature. How many times have we seen studies where people, their entire diet is coming from supplements, right? The entire diet in some of these studies is, here's a protein supplement, have this 4 times a day. That is now your diet. Now, are they giving them, 250 grams a day of protein? No. But at the same time, we are talking about like 4 doses a day of protein supplements. And in those types of studies, we don't see really any meaningful prevalence of adverse events related to, chronically consuming only protein supplements for sometimes up to like 6 months. So, theoretically, they're probably using very high quality products in those kinds of studies, but the general point still holds. It's something that's worth looking into if you decide like, hey, I'm going to do 140 grams a day of protein from plant-based protein powders. Yeah, it's probably worth digging into it and maybe going for a brand that you really, really trust in terms of stringent quality control standards. But yeah, the real answer to that question is a little bit murky. I wish I could tell you thumbs up or thumbs down, but it's somewhere in between.
Can I chime in on this?
If you insist.
Well, I don't feel welcome, but I'm going to do it anyways. Which is a couple things to say here. One, Helms, you talked just a little bit ago about it's not the presence of meat unless it's charred and red meat that's causing these issues, right? It's the presence of the kind of some of the cornerstones of the vegan diet, if you will, right? So I'd make this analogous to there's a lot of lifters here listening. Somebody say, hey, this endurance athlete has better cardiovascular health. See, they're not doing any weight training. Well, it's not the lack of weight training that's leading to the cardiovascular health. It's the endurance training. In reality, think how much healthier they would be if they also did weight training, right? Think about the individual that does weight training. Hey, they're so strong, yes, but look at the other aspect they'd get. So I look at it from that lens as well. Also, when I heard the supplement question, hey, this person is just having supplements 4 times a day, assuming they're not exceeding, heavy metal content, and I'm familiar with some of the data Trex was referring to, and I don't believe most of the products that were tested in some of these studies are exceeding that limit. My question is, why is this person doing this, right? Are they fearful of any other foods? Are they so beholden to this, what they've heard? Maybe it's whey 4 times a day, and it's I have to have this, high quality, fast digesting protein so frequently, and they think that for some reason that's what's necessary. So my question would be why, and what else are they missing out on, especially micronutrient wise, because they're not deviating from this plan at all, from doing that. And then what is what are some of the downstream effects if you're just having so much volume of, let's say powder and water? That's a lot of liquid. What is that doing to your satiety, and how is that affecting everything else that you're taking in? So my question to that person, my answer first and foremost would be no, in terms of I think the protein is fine and the protein quality is fine, and I agree with Helms' comments on protein quality. But why are they doing that? Is that because they have some fear of something else? And then what is that doing to downstream effects, things like satiety from taking in that volume of liquid? And is that affecting their other food consumption and potentially micronutrient consumption? So it could have some other downstream effects if they're not sure why they're doing that. But in isolation, I don't view the protein as a problem, but it's what else could stem from this. So that's my contribution to the discussion.
Actually, it's a really important contribution, and it actually dovetails nicely into the last protein question I see from Nick Dosh. I've been having an intra-workout smoothie with carbs and protein. I have had previous symptoms of EOE. Is that a gastrointestinal symptom? EOE? Can one of you guys look that up real quick while I?
Never heard of it.
With
in my
milk
life.
Protein. I've been introduced hydrolyzed whey into this to build a tolerance. Thoughts? I've been having this smoothie my whole training career. I'm a competitive natural bodybuilder and an MSU student. I have this intra because of the struggle eating around training, which is, I think, directly to your point, Mike. I have 10 grams of hydrolyzed whey, 10 grams of a pea brown rice protein blend, and 8 grams of egg white protein powder. I want to be able to have whey again because of its superiority compared to other proteins. So those are 2 things where I think, Nick, potentially your beliefs about the importance of the superiority of one protein source, and 2, about the importance of eating around training, that might be driving a behavior that may not be necessary or doing much for you that does seem to have a negative consequence. Do we have a definition of EOE?
We do. It's inflammation of the esophagus.
Esophageal. Okay, got it right. All right. So yeah, I think if you're experiencing EOE and these I guess, relatively high GI tract symptoms related to what you're doing. And it's based upon, thank you, Nick Bird. He also popped in the definition in there. And you believe it's because, okay, I need to eat around training, but it's hard to do so, and I need to have high quality protein. I think we need to establish two things. One, if you're consuming an appropriate total daily protein intake and an appropriate protein spread, which I'm actually angry to learn this, the bar is really low, because I spent the entire first 10 years of my career making sure that I got at least 5 servings, equidistant protein, sandwiching my workouts for the longest time. Now I just do it habitually without thinking about it, because I've been bodybuilding since, well, let's say I'm old, and I don't have to do anything about it. But we don't have very convincing data that once you're getting a roughly even protein spread across 3 meals per day or more, that there's going to be any potential benefit because of the digestion time course of what happens when you're eating all of the other things we eat besides protein, and therefore the appearance of amino acids in the blood and all that stuff. We also seem to see a plateauing effect. And if I'm being generous and shifting it up because you're a bodybuilder, and I think here's the highest it would be. Like if we look at the most recent meta-regression, I believe it's by Lopez and colleagues, or is it Nunez? I'll look it up really quick. It's a 2022 meta, and you can just look visually at the systematic review and meta-analysis of protein intake to support muscle mass and function in healthy adults by Nunez and colleagues, published 2022. We've talked about breakpoint analyses back in the day on the paper by Morton and colleagues that I was a part of. We're going to be talking about this deficit next week. There's the Tagawa paper in 2022. All of them seem to consistently find that as you go higher and higher and higher, there's big diminishing returns. And I think the easiest one to look at is if you look at the continuous analysis in this paper by Nunez in 2022, it probably has the best combination of statistical modeling, inclusion criteria, most recent, most studies in it. There's essentially what looks like to be a flat line if you look at the slope between 2 to 3 grams per kilogram of protein intake, and this is in the state of a surplus. And again, to be really clear, Tagawa found like at 1.3, the slope starts to flatten out a lot. But maybe if you get all the way up into that 2 to 3 gram range, there's something going on that could be cumulatively beneficial. But we're talking about a trivial to small effect size at most. So if you're anywhere in the range of 2 to 3 grams per kilogram of protein intake, I would argue you're taking in plenty to not be concerned about the quality of the protein. And then I would argue, so long as you're getting in at least 3 roughly even boluses of that total amount or more, then you don't really need to worry about the timing around training, unless you're somehow shifting your nutrition to be really, really far away from it, which I wouldn't recommend. So like if you were training 5 a.m. in the morning, but you also skipped breakfast and you ate all of your meals, starting at 1 p.m. until say 9 p.m., maybe that could be an issue, maybe. But outside of doing something like that, you might be creating a scenario where you're creating a problem for yourself. And just knowing that, hey, outside of getting at least 3 and at least 2 grams per kilogram of protein, I am good to go and I can ease up. I don't need to have anything during. I don't need to have specific protein sources. This may make your life a lot easier. And I know when I heard this information and I saw the data, even as a science communicator, I had pushback against it because of the effort I put into the timing and the dose and the quality forever. But I can tell you now, more than a decade afterwards, with just having those kind of being my cornerstones and doing that with all my clients, talking 100 plus people to the stage, it's not going to make a difference, and it will make your life easier. And it'll be much better to train without having, like pain in your esophagus or in your gastrointestinal tract. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully I've freed you of some things, and you can look back on all the things you've done as a bodybuilder and realize that not all of them are necessary, and hopefully find some acceptance in that, like I eventually did.
All right, good stuff. Now, there's 2 questions left that have really caught my eye, and I specifically want to get Zourdos' take on these. It's such a treat to have him here. He is the rare guest. We need to bring him back more often, but I want to throw a couple questions at Zourdos. They are both generally about training, and I think they're both questions that Dr. Zourdos is uniquely qualified to answer. So the first one is, if I'm making the same strength progress on my lifts, doing high volume or low volume, so either way I'm making the same progress in strength, Is the underlying muscle growth likely the same when we're looking over the course of months, i.e., past the neurological adaptation phase?
First of all, it is a treat for you to have me on. I'm glad that you recognize that. You know, I was told the last time I was on here, when Iron Culture became Iron Culture presented by Mass, that I wasn't really giving off the spirit of the show, which was I wasn't being self-promoting enough. I wasn't being conceited enough. So now that I'm back here tonight, I'm glad that you've recognized that it is your honor that I'm here, and I appreciate you. Actually, I don't appreciate you saying that. You should say that, and I'll go ahead and crush these questions and save the episode from all that nutrition talk. So now that I've thoroughly been here in the spirit of the show, you know, Trex, I did see this question earlier, and I jotted down a few things about it. So first, if someone's making the same strength progress doing high volume opposed to doing low volume, I'm not too surprised at that, right? So just taking that first, saying, hey, hypertrophy aside, which I know is the crux of the question, and we're going to get to that, but just saying, hey, we have high volume versus low volume, and I'm making the same strength progress. Somebody might say, well, why wouldn't you make greater progress with higher volumes? Well, as Helms pointed out earlier, if we have the now famous Pelland meta-analysis, meta-regression, we can see that there is a relationship between volume and strength gains, but it's not nearly as strong as the relationship between volume and muscle growth. And so, you know, there was an older meta-analysis from Ralston now, and you're getting into 5, 6, 7 sets per week or so for strength, you know, on a certain exercise, and you're really maximizing to the most part your strength progress. You might still see some benefit after that, but the vast majority of your strength gains are coming from increasing from 0 to 1 set, 1 set to 2 sets, 2 sets to 3 sets, right? And then after that per week, that's when that added volume is really doing more for muscle hypertrophy. So I'm not too surprised that someone would make similar progress with low volume on strength and with high volume. So now, after that, to get to the hypertrophy part of the question, which is the underlying muscle growth likely the same over the course of months, meaning past the neurological adaptation phase? So my answer is no, or at the very least, you can't say. But when we say past the neurological adaptation phase, now I'm thinking, okay, somebody's asking from the beginner mindset once they're getting out of the first few months or so of training or so forth, right? So, okay, they get past that. And then I'd say over the first like 8, 10, 12 weeks, right, of training, you're having muscle growth. It's not as detectable in the research, but it's still occurring, and then you can visually see it in some people. But in the short term, let's say 10 weeks, we don't really observe muscle growth to do anything for strength, right? That doesn't mean that the relationship and even a causality isn't there over the very long term. I think that it is. But the debate that has raged on over the past however many years now, the one thing about that debate that I think is good is that it is true. We don't observe this in over 8, 10, 12 weeks, that muscle growth is causing strength gains or is related to strength gains over that initial phase. Don't conflate that with me saying I don't think it's related or causing strength gains over the very long term. I think it is. But if we continue on past that neurological phase and now we're getting out into some months of training, my answer is I don't think that the growth is going to be the same, right? If we qualify what we mean by low volume, let's say we mean something at low volume as 7 to 8 sets per week on a muscle group, as opposed to 15 sets per week on a muscle group. I think the 15 sets per week is a much safer bet. You're going to see more growth over the long term. Over the course of a month, will we notice a difference? Maybe, maybe not. Over 2 months, but the longer out you go, the more I would bet on that high volume winning out. Are there reasons why high volume might not be the way to go at some points than the others? For sure, right? That person has a lot of stress in their life. They're not sleeping very well, whatever it may be, and they're not really in a position where they can handle all of that volume at a certain time. So to answer the question directly, if strength gains are the same as high and low volume, I would not take that to mean that gains in muscle are also going to be the same during that time. It's very possible that you would grow more with more volume, even if that didn't augment your strength. Also, it's important how you get that volume. Strength is specific. So if you're doing a certain magnitude of volume, let's say on the barbell bench, and then you keep that low volume, but then you add on assistance movements or other movements, you're going to get significantly more growth probably with that higher volume. But if you were to just then stay with the barbell bench press at that only bench press sets, right, your strength would be the same, and that those other exercises may not be augmenting that strength because strength is specific to that exercise. So I don't think you can conflate those. I don't think you should conflate those. I think you should view in the bigger picture, if you train for strength, you might get muscle growth as a byproduct of that training, right? If you train for muscle growth, you will get strength as a byproduct and perhaps as a causal factor of that training. But over the longer term, I wouldn't say your strength is indicative of your muscle growth, to take the question down to its most basic form.
All right, good stuff. And Mike, while I've got you here, I've got another one that I think relates really closely to the meta-regression by Pellin, specifically on the volume side of things. So we got a question from someone who said they're curious about volume recommendations from a lot of science-based fitness influencers. They're giving out a lot of recommendations, but isn't that only useful if you have no training history? So I think the question is basically, when we are giving someone a recommendation about how much volume they should do, is it really possible to do that without knowing their training volume history? Should our recommendation be highly specific to their training history? What do you make of this question and the idea of setting a kind of, roughly speaking, one-size-fits-all kind of quantitative suggestion for how many sets per week someone ought to do in order to achieve a certain level of growth?
Yeah. So we can go about this a few ways, and I think this is a really important question, not just for volume, but for really anything that we're trying to communicate. Because we can get into this game which is technically correct, of saying, oh man, it's really hard and almost impossible to be able to give a recommendation because we may see some differences between individuals. We also need to figure out what somebody was doing previously, what's their history, what do they have going on right now, how much time do they have to train, what's their diet like, are they stressed with school, are they stressed with work, all of these things. But I do think there's merit to giving a general guideline threshold for somebody to start, because otherwise everything just becomes so esoteric and there's almost no gauge of where to go. So I think it's appropriate to be able to say, and by the way, I don't think the meta-regression or a study's job is to tell somebody how to train, right? That should almost never happen. You see a mean outcome in a study, 0 people may have actually gotten that mean outcome, right? That's what the mean outcome is, right? So it's just pooling all of these findings together. But I think it's okay to have a starting point, right? So it's okay to say, hey, somebody says, hey, I have some general training background, not a lot of training background, but what do I need to do to gain some muscle? What are you doing now? I'm training a couple days a week. All right, let me tell you what. I want you to go in and I want you to do about 8 to 10 sets per week on most of those muscle groups. It's probably a great place to start for that person. Then they can progress from there. What I do is I would start a little conservative. That way, you're probably not going to overstress the person with anything. If it's way too easy, then you can go up from there. If it's too much, it's not going to be way too much because you started kind of on the bottom end of those guidelines. Then you can pull back. Maybe you need to allocate volume a little bit differently. You can ask some questions and figure out why. So yes, ideally, if you're coaching somebody, you have somebody that you're meeting with, whether it's in person or whether it's online, and you have a whole battery of questions that you're going to ask them, right? What's your training history? How long have you been training? How many sets per muscle group do you do per week? Then you have to also have to ask the question, is what you're getting even reliable, right? We know in dietetics, a 24-hour dietary recall is the gold standard, but not always reliable in and of itself. So I do think that having a starting point is okay, as long as a communicator, you couch that appropriately and you say, listen, this is where we're going to start. It does depend on these other factors. So ideally you would ask these things, but if you have nothing else, you're looking to go get in the gym today, you've been training for a few months, start somewhere 7-8 sets per week on a muscle group, see how you feel. You're going to progress. It's not going to make them weaker or smaller by doing that for a week or two. Then if you feel better, you can go up from there. So I do think in anything, if you want to get started in any sport, in anything, there's general tenets and recommendations where you can start. So I think that's okay, as long as we communicate them and qualify them appropriately, caveat here, caveat there. But it's okay to give somebody a place to start. But nobody's saying you should go out and do exactly what we see in these meta-analyses. And I saw another comment in here real quick about how, we talking about volume going up and up and up in these meta-regressions, and then people kind of go on forever with that. I don't think that's what these meta-regressions are saying. I think people are missing a lot in the Pelin meta-regression, and we had Josh on here, the pretty significant rate of diminishing returns that we see, right? So much of the increase in muscle growth is coming from these early increases, right? 1 sets up to 5 sets, up to 10 sets, up to 15 sets. And after you're getting past that, 18 sets or so forth, you're really, there's a good table in there about efficiency tiers. You really have to, once you get in these higher volumes, increase a lot of sets to really make it worth your while. And then can you do that? The other thing I would say is, even if, and I've written in mass about this before, even if we're going up to 40 some sets per week or something like that on a muscle group, and somebody's suggesting that we do that, okay, that might be okay for a short term, but that's not an all the time thing, most likely, right? I would then say, all right, we probably want to do some sort of volume cycling, right? Why is this the case? Just practically maintaining that on all muscle groups at one time probably is going to be a bit too much, right? Sure, you could have fatigue. You might just not have enough time to train. Your motivation might wane after a while, right? So there's so many things that can go in there, and we can go all day on this topic. But to get back to the main point on this, which is, I think it's okay to have general recommendations as long as the general caveats do apply and we communicate them appropriately. But nothing wrong with the starting point.
Yeah, I actually
Go
ahead. Yeah.
You go ahead.
I was going to say, I was going to kick it to you after making a short comment. True story, verifiable fact with evidence. I actually gave a lecture today because I'm teaching this semester. And in that lecture, I covered the results of that Pelin meta-regression. So the brilliant students at Duke are now getting the same education one might get from an Iron Culture episode, which is quite the compliment. But basically, the key point that I told my students, we show this, that classic kind of figure, the instant classic figure showing volume relative to weekly set volume. And they're like, so what's the point? What's the takeaway here? And my answer was 10 to 20 sets is plenty. That's really, like, for a lot of people who look at that figure, kind of the key takeaway. It's not necessarily, well, the x-axis goes up to 43, so I guess do 43 if you want the most, right? Usually, a very careful, nuanced interpretation of that figure and the corresponding table leads you to believe 10, 15, 20 sets a week is plenty, if not more than plenty, for the vast majority of people. And then there's going to be some unique scenarios where you might consider going beyond that, while acknowledging the pretty severely diminishing returns and the pretty disproportionate cost in terms of time and effort that you're putting in to get those slight incremental improvements and gains. With that being said, Helms, I put you in timeout to give the good Dr. Zourdos some time to shine on a special day. But I do want to kick it over to you because you look like you have so much to say. You looked like you've been in physical pain for the last 10 minutes as Zourdos has gotten his moment in the sun.
That had nothing to do with me having something to say. It's just anytime Zourdos speaks for a while, I just find myself in that space. I'm sure it's just correlated, not causative. But I remember when this question came in, I think it was actually 2 weeks ago, correct? It's probably, or something, maybe last week or 2 weeks ago. And I specifically remember the wording of it. And I had an impression that they might have misinterpreted something about the methods of the meta-regression. I could be wrong, and it might have just been, they typed it up on YouTube quickly. But I think it's just really important to understand that this was a meta-regression that included about 60% of the studies on trained individuals and about 40% on untrained. And so the question about how does this apply to anyone with a training history, I think it's important to understand probably 600 of the 1,000-ish participants that were included in this meta-regression did have a training history. And just due to sampling variance across all the studies that are represented by that general trend, and especially if you look at the sub-analyses on only trained or untrained participants, it still holds true despite that. So on average, we pluck a random person out of the world, and we bet money on giving them some amount of volume along this meta-regression line. We would expect on average to see a representative response, all else equal, which is a really tough thing to wrap our human brains around. That whole all else equal thing means that literally everything else is the same, because this is not only volume producing this trend line. This is everything and the effective volume in isolation. So anyway, I just think that's an important point. The way that they, I should say, determined these effects was looking at a mixed population group, trained and untrained individuals. And they also actually used data from another meta-analysis on control groups to figure out what is like the true baseline, the effect of multiple measurements in someone not training, to see, okay, that is what we're bootstrapping 0 sets to, then compare. So some of those potential methodological things may not have come across. It's not just a study of untrained participants with no training history. This is that relationship even in people with a training history.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you what, guys, we have, I believe, in my opinion, done a good deed for the chat. I think we've done it justice. We've answered quite a few questions from the live chat. Helms, if you want to look and see if there's anything else that you want to address in there, please feel free. Take a moment to do that. But while you're doing that, we are going to kind of wrap up here. We'll have either 0 or 1 more questions to chat about. But in the meantime, I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. It obviously means a great deal to us. We sincerely appreciate the fact that people take time out of their Monday night to spend about 90 minutes with us to talk science, talk fitness, talk training, talk shop. It never gets old, and we never become accustomed to the fact that people are willing to set aside that time and join us and be part of this community. So thanks so much for joining us as always. We will never take it for granted. Helms, how are you feeling? You feel like we did enough, or you got 1 question left?
There's one that'll take way too long about whether we should view body recomposition in a certain way or not, because that's a whole episode. But there's actually one that I think, Mike, you recently looked at this, so it might be good to kick it over to you. Any tips on how long before bed I should stop eating for better sleep quality? And are there any things that are better to eat in the evening than others for sleep quality? Because I know we just wrote a quick takes on that for the upcoming issue. You said you dove into it. I know what I've read, but I haven't looked at the updated research on this. Any thoughts?
So yeah, a few. You may be a little bit better than me. So in the upcoming issue, we have some pretty monstrous articles coming out. I really like this issue that's going to drop here on the last day of January, right? It comes out February 1st technically, but a little inside baseball. It's always going to come out the last day of the month. And we have some quick takes. So quick takes are little 1-pagers we've been putting together just to provide a little bit of extra info in each issue. And we have one on beta-alanine, we have one on time-restricted feeding, and we have one on sleep. And I was able to put together the one on sleep from scratch, and then we all, of course, edited it. And one thing I noted is I was going to put something into the quick take on macronutrient distribution and sleep. However, when I got into the literature, I saw some previous articles that we had written in mass, and I got through those, and read some papers suggesting that higher quality protein and more protein in your diet was related to better sleep quality. Then I got into some newer studies that contradicted that. And I did not feel comfortable adding that into the quick take. So I focused the quick take on sleep recommendations, sleep hygiene, good habits is getting in bed, turning off the lights, things like that. And so I would say that if I was forced to put something in there, potentially ensuring an appropriate macronutrient breakdown and a sufficient amount of protein specifically would help with sleep quality. However, not being an expert in this area and getting into some of the newer literature, I thought it was somewhat contradictory to what I thought I knew. Thus, I didn't feel confident putting any conclusive statements down on paper. So I'll leave it at that.
I think it's a great response. Love the humility. And I would say I'm relatively unconvinced on the protein data. Trex, unless you know something I don't, the one thing that does seem relatively consistent is that eating large energy contents, so basically big meals with a lot of calories, especially that seem high in fat and carbs, like we said, that unclear relationship with protein within an hour or two of bed does seem to have a negative impact on sleep on balance. So if you are going to eat something before bed, I would keep it to, and this is completely pulling a number out of my butt, 10% of total calories or less, and primarily have it be from a protein source if you want that, or if you need it to hit your protein target, or maybe just don't eat in the last couple hours before bed.
And the way to do that, right? I think all of this gets at a bigger picture. The way to do that is to make sure you're eating sufficient calories throughout the day, right? Because what typically happens, right? They're trying to eat in a deficit, or they're don't want to eat too much, and then all of a sudden they're in a huge deficit. They're starving at night. All they've done is eaten lean foods all day, and then they're just go raiding the kitchen, and that's when they're putting in 30-40% of their total daily calories at night, a lot of high fat content at that time of day. So I would say obviously on the money, but the way to do that is to ensure you're eating appropriately throughout the day. And as you can see, Skype agrees with me.
Yeah, and if I may, gentlemen, I think if you really wanted to go out of your way and hedge your bet and say, I want to eat in a way that messes up my sleep tonight, there's a pretty clear playbook for that. You would have an extremely large meal, extremely close to bed, and it would particularly check two additional boxes. It would be very high in fat, and it would be extremely spicy. That is a recipe for disaster. You are not going to have a good time. So those are kind of like how to do everything wrong. And when we look at how to do everything wrong, we get some hints about how to do things right, and so we can kind of work back from there and say, okay, if you're going to be eating close to bed, if it's just like a little protein heavy snack, light on the calories, honestly, I can tell you from experience, I can have some cottage cheese, some low fat cottage cheese or a protein shake 15 minutes before bed. No big deal. I cannot have a big spicy fatty meal 15. If I go lay down, I'm going to have heartburn in 10 seconds, right? So that's one thing. Another thing that I'm going to throw out there, a little curveball that I think is lesser known because I didn't know it until perusing some interesting papers literally 2 days ago. But apparently there's been a couple little papers sneaking around out there that have been indicating that there may be some relationships between electrolytes and sleep quality. So a couple studies indicating that excess sodium intake may impair sleep quality. A couple studies, and normally I would look into that and I'd say, well, high sodium is usually correlated with a pretty crappy diet across 100 different, things, if you're eating a diet that's all prepackaged, ultra processed foods, you're getting a lot of sodium. But one of the things that gives me pause with my cynicism and skepticism is that there are also some papers, like I said, too much sodium, sleep disruption. There are also papers hinting at the idea that inadequate potassium may also lead to some sleep disruption, and specifically that this is perhaps more pertinent when we're looking at the kind of nighttime intakes of sodium and potassium. So if you're telling me that there is a research hinting at this idea that proximity to bed matters, and you're telling me that too much sodium or insufficient potassium matters, and we know that, and, crack open a physiology textbook, those two are playing tug of war across like 900 different body functions. So for me, when you include the temporal element, the kind of timeline aspect, and this kind of contrasting effects with sodium and potassium, that's where you really capture my interest in terms of just like, basic biological plausibility. You're kind of checking some of those boxes for me. Now, am I willing to give a definitive conclusion on what I think about that literature? Absolutely not. I need to dig into it. All I've learned in the last 2 days is that it exists and that it's kind of interesting to think about. Someday, mark my words, I will dig into that and provide a more definitive perspective on whether or not I think it's legit. But here's what I will say. If you were like a hyper sleep quality maximalist and you were really struggling with poor sleep quality, and like people in my family have really struggled with sleep issues, they've done sleep studies, and the doctors are like, we don't know what's going on, and we've done all the sleep hygiene stuff, and we've messed with even the more speculative elements of what to eat and when relative to sleep. If you're at your wit's end and you're like, I just want any other rock to turn over because I just want to feel like I'm at least trying things that may have some plausibility, it's something worth considering, is looking at your total day sodium and potassium intake. You're never going to regret, most people on a Western diet are never going to regret having a little less sodium and a little more potassium. And especially if you look within maybe the 6-hour window prior to bedtime, it may be another rock that you could turn over. I'm not promising you a doggone thing because I haven't read that literature closely, but it's something that came across my desk. And as science communicators, I think some of the value that we deliver is by saying, I absolutely read this data until it had nothing else to tell me, and I am telling you definitively how I feel about this. That's part of it. I think there's also some value of saying like, hey, here's some weird thing that I've never heard anyone talk about that seems to be kind of catching some steam in the literature. So that's where this is, and eventually I'll actually like look into it.
Well, I can say that I've had some particularly bad nights of sleep after getting a late night Indian meal. And I think about it, it's like high fat, high calorie, high sodium, and I'm not always getting the dish that also has potatoes in to push that potassium up. So that could have been the thing. So, hey, folks, if you want to make sure you don't sleep well, order that Indian hot lamb Rogan Josh with garlic cheese naan and ask him to hold any inclusion of potato in there. And just go to town and make sure you eat it till the point of discomfort and then try to go directly to sleep. And by the way, it pairs well with Indian? A nice cup of joe. And I think you will have just an amazing night of sleep. Yeah.
Well, what I usually do every 4th of July is I'm a huge fan of the hot dog eating contest. And I'm one of those guys. I like to feel like I'm part of the show, part of the game. So what I do is I can't eat 66 hot dogs in 12 minutes. So I give myself 24 minutes. And so before bed, usually on the 4th of July, after watching it and kind of enjoying it, then I'll do my own little run through, and I sleep terribly after I eat. Honestly, even any number of hot dogs over 40 late at night really messes with my sleep. So it very well could be the sodium. Yeah.
39's okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think I've ever hit 39 on the nose, but I just noticed whenever I really tap into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I come to regret it. But anyway, all right, folks, I think that does it for tonight's show. Once again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank the good Dr. Zourdos for a special guest visit here. We will be back. Helms, tell me, are we with Martin 1 week from today? Is that correct?
I'm almost positive we are.
Yeah, so I believe, and will that be live with Martin?
I am almost positive it will be.
Wow. So we may have a special treat there. I believe this upcoming Monday we're going to be live at 7 p.m. with the good Dr. Martin Refalo, and we'll be talking all about the latest protein paper that we, the three of us, published. Mike, we would have loved to include you, but Martin insisted. Yeah, he said absolutely not. So.
And he was correct, because I wouldn't have had anything to add.
Well,
Good
there you
decision
go.
by him.
So yeah, everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Hope you have a fantastic week, and we will be back in 7 days.